Life Audio.
Hello, and welcome to the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I am your host, John Seidel. This is your home for real stories, radical vulnerability, and remarkable comebacks. In the end, this podcast is a place for the desperate, the downtrodden, the destitute, and especially the drunk. But it's also a place of hope and healing. I know that firsthand because I'm the Christian who became an alcoholic, not the other way around. Today, I've found sobriety after decades of struggling. But more importantly than finding sobriety, I found Jesus. My prayer is that as I interview people just like you and just like me, along with professionals in the fields of trauma, faith, and addiction recovery, you will find the peace that is available to you through Christ on the other side of whatever you're going through and whatever addiction that might be. Because let's face it, we're all addicted to something. So welcome. Let's get radically vulnerable as we explore what it looks like to be on this journey of messy sanctification. We'll be right back after this. So what do you do when your faith tells you one thing and says one thing, but your actions tell you and say another? And when the coping mechanisms you've built to survive end up controlling you? Those are two of the questions that we are going to talk with today's guest about. And this is someone I am so encouraged to introduce you to, and maybe some of you already know her. Her name is Dr. Alison Cook. And when I say she was integral in my addiction recovery and still is, I don't say that lightly. Her two books, Boundaries for Your Soul and I Shouldn't Feel This Way, are incredible. And if you order my book, Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic, and you sign up and get the free bonuses that you get for buying the book, I have a resource guide, and I think it's about 27 or so other books that I've read that have been helpful for me. And both of those books are on the resource guide because they definitely have been helpful. And I think if you want to read them first and then read my book, if you want to read my book and then read, it's really important. And I think what I've learned from her is, well, it can't really completely just be summed up in one podcast, but some of the most important things I've learned from her, I should say, are what it looks like to have parts of ourselves that are unhealed and unhealthy, and also simultaneously have healthy parts of ourselves that can do amazing things and get by. And then what it's like to engage in cognitive dissonance, where you can know one thing and want to do one thing and yet not do it or do something else. And so in our conversation today, we're going to really dig deep into the messy space where faith and psychology meet. She's going to explain why naming our struggles is so important, and also something that she calls a holy reframe. And my goodness, a holy reframe is so important. And so I'm really, I'm honored that she decided to join me for this podcast. And I really hope that it encourages you to the extent that all of her writing has encouraged me. So if you like, maybe you want to pause at certain points and just digest it. If you need to take notes, like, do that. Whatever it is, whatever you need to do to really make sure that you are engaged or in a space to hear this, I think is important. But before we get to that, let me just say we are getting really close to the launch of Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. We are just over a month away. And so if you listen to this and haven't bought the book yet, if you're hearing this for the first time, please go to christianalcoholic.com. You can pre-order the book there. It's still available up until launch through the publisher. You can get it for 40% off and free shipping, which is better than you can do on Amazon. And, like I've said before, it technically behooves me better to point you to Amazon because you can climb the charts and all the great stuff. But I want this is not about making money. It's not about charts. It's about getting a resource into your hands or someone you love's hands. So go to christianalcoholic.com and you can grab the book. You can get the free resources as well. So now, without further ado, Dr. Alison Cook. Dr. Cook, thank you so much for joining the Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic podcast. I think I covered this a little bit in the intro, but this is such a treat for me because you were integral in my recovery process. And I talk about that in the book. And so to now get to talk to you in person and hopefully others get to see and hear what I've experienced, I just really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much, John. I'm super grateful for what you're doing and what you're speaking to. And I'm glad to have been a part of it. I'm glad to have this conversation with you.
So for people, like I said, I gave a little bit in the intro, but what is the work that you're really focused on? I know you kind of seesaw between Boston and Wyoming, which are just as someone who lived in New York City for 7 years, they're just totally different worlds. So what is the work that you're really focused on now?
My main goal is to just kind of become a hub, not only of my own work, but the other folks who are doing great work out there of Christian mental health resources. There's just such a need for that integration, right, between what science is telling us and what our Christian spirituality and faith tradition tells us. And so everything I'm trying to do is trying to bring together those two worlds. So I do mostly educational resources right now through my podcast and my books. I do a very little bit of consultation and private coaching, but primarily now I'm trying to create these resources and places where people can find these resources.
And of those resources, obviously you have the books. The two especially that have been integral for me are Boundaries for Your Soul and I Shouldn't Feel This Way. And you also have this great podcast, The Best of You podcast, which I have just really loved. I mean, I talk about radical vulnerability in my book, and you've been vulnerable and open. I mean, even to the point I just loved the other day. I mean, it was one of the episodes where you're talking about you struggle with the idea of speaking, and you struggle with the idea of what does it take in order to be even an author in this world, where you're talking to Caitlin Beatty, where you have to promote yourself. And I just love hearing how honest you are about that.
Oh, yes. I don't know how else to do it, right? So I want to create these resources, but there's also some of these realities, as you know, you're getting ready to publish a book behind the scenes of how this all kind of comes together. And I think the more we can be transparent with what goes on in this industry, other people are, the folks who are listening to you are dealing with some of this behind the scenes stuff in a lot of different environments. And the more we can just be honest and name, that's my whole thing, is naming things without shame, naming things about myself that are hard, naming things in the world that are hard without shame. We're just being honest. I think that's how we start to find our way to each other and find our way to deeper connections. So,
well, that is a great segue into kind of one of the first questions I want to talk about. Naming is a huge part of it. When I was finally got to the point where I was naming, what was going on inside of me, that was really the gateway. And there's a part of that where you talk about in the book, I Shouldn't Feel This Way, which I have right here. And by the way, just to show people, here's the interesting part. I mean, you can see I have it all marked up, but I actually listened to the book first, and it was so good. I listened to it, and then I bought a copy because I'm like, I have to take notes, So I would recommend that for other people. But you talk about cognitive dissonance in the book, and I know that was like a breakthrough moment for me, because I think there was a for a long time, it's like, how can I be the Christian who wrote a book on mental health and then became an alcoholic, right? And I think part of that is this idea of cognitive dissonance. So, can you explain the concept of cognitive dissonance, and then especially as it might relate to people who are struggling with, like Paul, doing things they don't want to do?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we all, on some level, as a human being, experience this phenomena of cognitive dissonance. If you think about that word dissonance, comes from the world of music, where two notes just don't go together. They just jar. They're not. There's no harmony there. It's just dissonance. It doesn't sound good. And so, what it means inside of us, this cognitive dissonance, the boilerplate classic example, is the person who is touting climate change while flying around on their private jet. Now that's an easy one for us to go,
Right.
golly, how do you have that dissonance, right? You're saying one thing or you're believing one thing on one hand, but your actions, your behaviors are directly opposed to that belief. And that's a big kind of funny example, but this happens inside of us every day. I believe that these things are true, but my actions are diametrically opposed to that. Sometimes we have conflicting beliefs. I believe this and I believe this. And those two things don't really go together. I think we saw a lot of that, currently in our political climate. We're seeing a lot of dissonance, right? Dissonance in and of itself is not the problem. The problem, and I say this in the book, we're going to have conflicting beliefs. We're going to have conflicting beliefs and actions at times. As a parent, it's the old trope, do what I say, not what I do, right? That's
Right.
exactly what we're talking about in that trope. The thing with dissonance that we have to be honest about is when it's happening, where we're not deceiving ourselves, where we really get into trouble with dissonance. And I go into this in the book, is when we start rationalizing
Yes.
the discrepancy, when we start justifying the
Yes.
discrepancy, because we're really there starting down the slippery path of self-deception. We're
Yes.
deceiving ourselves. Or we're denying it. We're saying this isn't really happening. We're making up excuses for it. Ooh, that's when we get into a slippery slope of not good places in our soul. When we're honest about it, when we're like, man, I will say to my kids, this, I know I shouldn't be doing this. I know I shouldn't. And I am,
Right.
and I am. And I'm not making up an excuse. Again, that gets back to that naming without shame. Now, ultimately, we want to work through dissonance. So we arrive at a healthier balance between the two competing things. But the first step is naming it honestly without shame.
And you talk about also in the book just kind of how there are the same thing where you say, listen, cognitive dissonance is a normal part of the human experience, right? It's when we try to deny it or cover it.
Yep.
And you also talk about how even coping mechanisms, right, are a normal part of the human experience, right? If we were just to sit and think about just all the crud in the world and in our lives all the time, like
Yes.
that wouldn't be healthy.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you have this amazing list of how to tell when things have become unhealthy copingisms, but maybe if you just have, a couple ways that come to mind, even from the book of how do we know when something has become an unhealthy coping mechanism?
Yeah, one of the things I say in the book, there's a chapter on numbing, right? Which is one of the things we can all point to, right? And so what I'll say to people is there's a difference. We do need to check out at times. And I am the first to admit that, right? In my own life. But there's a difference between, at the end of the day, saying, man, I've had a rough day. I can't deal. So I'm going to just let myself watch reality television on Netflix for a few hours because I just can't deal with much else. And then tomorrow morning, I'll get up and face it.
Yeah.
Right? That there's a strategic decision there that says, I'm gonna shut down tonight. I'm gonna escape, healthy escape. Now, ideally, that choice in that moment isn't something that's harming us. So there's a difference between saying I'm just gonna have a glass of wine tonight. If I know that I can tolerate that and it doesn't become a slippery slope into an addiction, then if we're grabbing something that we can't actually exercise control over. So that's why I use the Netflix example. But there's a difference between that sort of self leadership, a strategic choice of I need to decompress in this moment. Maybe I'll take a walk, maybe I'll take some deep breaths, but also maybe I'll watch some Netflix. You know what I mean? It's not
Right.
always the most, there's a spectrum of healthy coping strategies. That's very different, that category I just described, than a pattern of behaviors over time, where every single night I work throughout my day and then I go bury myself
Mm.
in television, in entertainment, in social media, in food, in whatever the thing is, day after day after day after day. And I'm never circling back to become consciously aware of the things that are hard in my life that I actually need to work through with intention. And so that's where we start to let those numbing devices, those just keeping ourselves constantly distracted, constantly hooked up to some sort of kind of false dopamine hit. Maybe it's a real dopamine hit, but we're hooked up to it in such a way that we're never unhooking ourselves to face even the sometimes painful emotions, the dissonance, the challenges that really need our conscious, mindful attention.
And so this may seem like an obvious question or a question with an obvious answer to you, but I fear that maybe it's not obvious to some people who are listening, which is,
Yeah.
okay, I hear what you're saying, but you don't know what I know how tough and hard those things are to deal with, right? I mean, I ran from mine for
Yeah.
years and then
Yep.
realized through EMDR therapy, there's things I had even, stuffed,
Yeah.
that I didn't even know fully what I was dealing with. So yeah, okay, you guys are saying that, but you don't know how hard. Why do I have to face those things? Why can't I just shop it away, drink it away, whatever?
Yeah. So, first of all, there is something we call pacing, which, if you've done EMDR therapy, where you shouldn't face all those emotions. If you've never done this work, if you've never developed a practice, I see this as a spiritual practice, right? It's part of our spiritual practices is to mind our mind, is to pay
Mm,
attention to what we're thinking about, what we're feeling, what we're noticing, even our pain points. If you've never done this, there's going to be a backlog. You are probably going to want to do it in a supportive community with a therapist, with a small group, with a group of friends. You don't want to do all of that by yourself because there's a backlog there and it can feel overwhelming to folks. But once you've established, and that was my story early on, even as a therapist in training in my late 20s, early 30s, I wasn't doing this work myself.
mm,
And so when I started to, it was very overwhelming. Um, Now, in my life, I've done so much of this work that it's actually a joy. I've made
mm,
friends with
mm.
these parts of myself. I've examined the deeper recesses of my soul. It's not that there aren't places there that I don't still go, whoa, what is that doing there? But it's that I'm less shocked by it. It's that I'm less overwhelmed by it. It's that I'm like, oh, yes, of course. There you are, old friend. And much more quickly able to access the grace and goodness of God in those moments. So it is a practice over time. And so, yes, if you're new to this work, it's going to take a minute to wean yourself off of the numbing and coping. Sometimes the other thing that's interesting, especially for Christians, is sometimes folks cope with otherwise good, healthy things. I
Mm,
see this particularly, like I wrote about this in The Best of You, we cope through our service,
mm.
right? We bury ourselves in the problems of others because
Yes.
we don't want to face our own. That that's layered, right? It's going to take some time and some practices to just balance out. I like to think about it if you think about working out, balance out those different muscles. It's wonderful to show up in support of others, but you also have to develop this other muscle of showing up for your own heartaches,
Mm.
your own pain. And so it's a process.
That reminds me of, I think it's in Mere Christianity where C.S. Lewis talks about the mom who was always busy, right? Like was always trying to, do the laundry and just like needed to be needed, right?
Yeah.
And how that
Yeah.
was an unhealthy thing for her,
Yes.
because it was done in a sense, it was unselfishness or
Right.
selfishness masquerading as unselfishness, right?
Yes. Yes.
And that was destructive. We'll be right back after this.
Yeah.
I think as I've talked about my journey, you know, and I've talked about and I've dealt with trauma that I went through as a child. What it seems to me that there's been a little bit of hesitance in the Christian community, not necessarily the Christian mental health community, of
Hmm.
which you are such a
Hmm.
leader in, but in the general Christian community, to talk about trauma, to want to deal with it. Even just some people that I've talked with is like, basically, is that kind of like the new agey science
Hmm.
stuff, right?
Hmm.
What have you seen when it comes to combating that, and how have you combated that, if you've seen it?
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's a growing awareness in Christian circles of the reality of trauma and its lasting impact on our lives. I think it's behind, obviously, the rest of the culture significantly. I think it's catching up. I use this term. I talked about it in the best of you. I talk about it a little bit, and I shouldn't feel this way. It's called spiritual bypassing. Whenever
Yes.
I post about that on social media, I always get quite a bit of traction. Folks really relate to it. But this is a lot of what we see in Christian circles, what's called spiritual bypassing, where you spiritualize
Yes.
problems. And it's the kind of thing where when someone says to you, if you're hurting, like, well, just trust God more. God will take that pain away. Or why are you sad? Jesus doesn't want you to feel sad, or faith over fear. These sort of simplistic over spiritualizations that don't honor the fullness and the reality of our human complexity that we also see modeled in Jesus, right? By the way, the fullness of human complexity at all the emotions. And so
Right.
I think there is that still within churches based on the reactions I get when I talk about it. Folks just really latch on to that. Like we sort of have this divide. We will go to our therapist, out in the world who's kind of helping us honor some of those painful experiences that affect our behaviors and affect our mental health today. But then at church, it's sort of like pray those things away, right? Just trust God. And there can be this over spiritualization. So that's what I really try to speak into. We don't want to not account for the spiritual reality of God's role in our lives. And also, we have so many tools available to us, just like in the field of medicine, where we
Right.
understand so much more deeply how the human mind, emotion, the nervous system works. And so I like to think about, John, I talk about this all the time on the podcast, but this Greek word sozo, that is translated salvation often in the New Testament. Work out your salvation, your sozo, with fear and trembling. Jesus uses it often. Your faith has saved you, sozo. That word is also translated as healing.
Mm,
And when you think about that word healing, we're working at our healing with God. Our
mm.
faith has healed us. That connotation of healing as an ongoing process. We're healing these different parts of us that have been wounded, and it's not a zap of the wand. It's a invitation into the ongoing work of healing. And I think so many of us have received that sort of one-dimensional, kind of one and done. You're saved, right? You've been rescued. You've been plucked out, which I'm not gonna argue theologically, but from a psychological perspective, that process of healing is an ongoing work. That work, you can call it sanctification, you can call it healing, is an ongoing work, right? Of being
Yes.
transformed into the image of Christ. And so I believe psychology comes right alongside of that and gives us these tools to work out that healing in partnership with God's Spirit. It's through trauma work, through EMDR, through nervous system regulation, through emotional health, really understanding the different parts of us, the different ways God made us. All of that is part of this beautiful journey that we're on.
I love that you talk about working it out, right? Because I think a big part
Yes.
of what I write about is messy sanctification, right? And that
Yes.
it is this ongoing process. And I wish that sanctification only meant that, like, I used to curse and now I don't curse.
Right.
But
Right.
sometimes
Right.
it's, I was an alcoholic and now I'm working on not being an alcoholic. You know what I mean?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
It doesn't always have to, sanctification and working out your healing doesn't always fit into this nice, pretty little
No,
box. And I
Messy
think
sanctification is a great phrase. It's
yes,
messy.
exactly. So thank you for that. And it also reminds me too of, I for my mental health, I still take medication, and I am
Yeah.
grateful for that. Right. And I know there's a lot of people that I've talked to that are like, okay, if I start taking medication, how soon can I get off of it? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I'm still on it, and I thank God
Yeah.
for that, because it helps regulate me,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Helps me take,
Yes.
those things in stride. And so my goal is not to get off of it. My goal is to just, as long as I need to be on it, I'm
Yeah.
going to be on it, right? It's a
Yes.
common grace that the Lord has
Yeah.
afforded us that I'm so
That's right.
thankful for.
That's right.
Um, you had a whole podcast episode on this, and so we don't have to rehash it, but people can go listen to it. But you talked about the role of sin in
Mhm.
kind of our struggles. And so, like I said, I mean, this is something that deserves a whole episode. But I think, there's some people that I've talked to about this, even Christians, who have said, don't talk about addiction in any way, shape, or
Mm.
form as it results or as it relates to sin. That's only using moralistic terms, and people will not get better. And then
Mm.
there's other people who have said, it's only a sin and a heart issue. And I think, just like in
Right.
my mental health work, I fall in between. It's like, I have a predisposition. There's alcoholism in my family. Did I have physical withdrawal? Yes, my body, all those things were physical. And yet I know I had a spiritual issue as well,
Mhm.
and that I
Sure.
was
That's
sinning
right.
by getting drunk. I knew I shouldn't, and I was, right? So
Yeah.
how do you, as a Christian mental health professional, thread that needle between
Yeah.
where sin comes in?
Yeah, and that binary you just described is back to that dissonance. I know I shouldn't, but I am. And I think that this is where I'm gonna introduce or bring into the conversation the original book that I wrote. This idea of there are different parts of us, the complexity
Yes.
of the human soul. So, which kind of explains some of that dissonance, I think, in a more robust way. But to your point about sin, I tend to the word has gotten a bad rap. It's gotten all this shaming connotation around it, right? An
Uh-huh.
overly moralistic shaming connotation. If you really just parse it out, the simplest understanding of the word sin is missing the mark. And we
Yeah.
don't sometimes we miss the mark out of willful, like you said, there's a heart issue, willful rejection of what God wants. Sometimes we miss the mark as a result. And so this would bring in the framing. How are we framing it? Sometimes we miss the mark um, because of our capacity has been exceeded.
Mm.
And and we miss the mark because we lash out at our family member, at a kid or whatever, um, because we've just been completely bombarded with too much in that
Yeah.
day, and it's not this willful, it. Now, listen, neither, anytime we're naming sin in our lives, it's only constructive insofar as we name it without shame, even
Mm-hmm.
to your point where we're able to go, "Oh my gosh, God, I do not want to follow you on this thing
Yeah.
you're asking me to do. And I might not." But again, I'm naming that honestly, right? To the degree that we are able to bring that before God honestly, or after the fact, man, I missed that one. And I genuinely didn't even see it coming. I didn't even know so much of those sins in the rearview mirror. We hindsight is 20. We look back and we
Yeah.
go, "Oh my goodness, what in the world was I thinking?"
Yeah.
Insofar as we can name those missteps without shame, we can just more and more and more receive the love and grace of God into our whole hearts and souls and minds. And we reduce that dissonance because we're not hiding
Mm-hmm.
from ourselves and we're not shaming ourselves. So, again, I think that word sin, I love what you said. Sometimes it is a posture of the heart, sometimes our missteps. Sometimes our missteps are lack of knowledge. Sometimes our missteps are rooted in our trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we're not still accountable for where we step over the line or miss the mark? Of course, but there's just so much more room for compassion
Yeah.
when we understand some of those different roots of
Yeah.
why we do what we do.
That actually brings me to a great question. It's a question I got that I want to pose to you. Um, and it was someone I was talking about in the process of writing the manuscript, and someone who saw an early copy, and they said, here's what I don't understand, John. I don't understand why you're talking about this trauma that happened as a child. You know, how did that lead to you getting drunk and drinking, 30 odd
Yeah.
years later? Like, I just don't understand that. And I think sometimes it took me aback because as you've used the term, I have been doing the work, but yet I
Yeah.
wonder if it's something I take for granted. And so I want to pose it. How does something like a childhood trauma, whether that's emotional
Yeah.
abuse, sexual abuse, whatever, verbal abuse, how does that lead to addictions? And how would you explain that to someone?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to look at it. So the best way that I understand it is this idea that we are comprised of many parts.
Mm-hmm.
And that language is it's not it's just a way of understanding the multifaceted nature of the human soul. It's the language of that's the language of Bessel van der Kolk, but it's also the language of scripture. It's also the
Yes.
language of Paul. I do what I do not want to do. Um, and and the idea that young parts of us, the 5-year-old you that was hurt, that was neglected, that was abused in one way or another, that part of you carries memories, and those memories live inside you. They don't go away. And when we think about trauma, I think about what Gabor Mate says, another trauma expert says, it's unwitnessed pain. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you're a child and something really awful happens to you if you don't have the chance to reconnect to a loving adult to help you understand what happened, you internalize that pain, you make meaning out of that pain, and children almost always make meaning that is self-blaming and self-shaming. And so 5-year-old you, something awful happens to you, and no one, either it's at the hands of an adult who was supposed to care for you and didn't, or was at the hands of a stranger and no one talked you through what happened. The meaning that children make tends to be, I did something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I deserved that.
Yeah.
Something that I did when I came home from school and my parent yelled at me, I did something that caused that. They don't understand their level of cognitive complexity. A child doesn't understand, oh, my parent is drunk or my parent was going through a bad time themselves and took it out on me. They don't understand that. They internalize that. Those internalized beliefs, internalized feelings, internalized experiences live on in our psyches, in our souls. So you arrive at adulthood. So in a parts framework, these are parts of us that exile that pain, right? And so we have this pain, something's happened. We don't know what to make sense of it. So another part of us has developed a meaning-making part of it that says it's your fault. You are not worth someone's love. You
Mm-hmm.
weren't worth someone showing up for you. That's a
Yes.
well-intended part of you. It's helping you cope. But it's how you're dealing with that pain that you don't know what to do with because no one is there helping you understand the pain of that moment, right? So you exile the pain and you create a narrative about it. This is what we do. So you arrive at adulthood with all of these you've still got the pain there that no one ever helped you walk through. Now you've got the narrative. A lot of this is happening at the subconscious level.
Right.
And then there's this third part of us that comes out. And guess what that part does? Because sometimes that pain flares up. It's like suddenly you're an adult and your wife or a friend trips over that same trigger. That pain of that starts to surface that goes all the way back to 5 years old. It's too much. And so another part of you comes out that says, I know how to make that go away. I'll reach for the booze.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we walk into adulthood with these parts of us that have kind of figured out how to cope and figured out how to survive in not necessarily the best of ways, but that's the best we could do.
Yes.
And so a lot of adult is beginning to unpack what was happening under the surface, which means we have to get to the root of that pain, to that childhood wound.
Yes. Thank you. That was such a great explanation, because I think what I tried to tell the person was, I'm not, as a 30, late 30s man, I'm not drinking away my, the sexual trauma every day. That's not what I'm doing.
Yes,
What I'm drinking away is how I've learned how that led to this, which is how you cope, and then you lies that you believe it. That's what I'm drinking away, but it started there.
100%.
Yeah.
In many ways, you're drinking away, our 30-year-old self is drinking away the pain of that narrative
Yes.
that I'm a piece of crap that didn't deserve love, that is
Uh-huh.
rooted in that memory that's way below conscious awareness.
Yes.
Oftentimes we're drinking away our current narratives about ourselves rooted in those childhood pain. And so it's we bring into adulthood all of those ways of coping that we
Uh-huh.
developed before we were ready, before we knew. So
Yeah.
helps you rethink parenting, right? As parents, our job isn't to be perfect. It's to make sure that our hope as best we can to help our children not take on the shame-based narratives about themselves.
Mm.
That's what's at the root, that shame.
Yeah. Absolutely. And so you've kind of paved the way for this, and you've talked about it a little bit, but I want to just give you the floor to talk about internal family systems. And so
Yeah,
that's this kind of parts work you've talked about. And I
yeah,
will say, Dr. Cook, when my trauma therapist, she's certified in EMDR as well as IFS, internal family systems and parts work. We got through the EMDR, and she says, okay, I think you're a great candidate for parts work. And basically then goes on to describe how I'm going to talk to other parts of myself. And I'm like, I feel like that's kind of crazy. Like, I feel like if I
yeah,
wasn't considered crazy before, now I'm going to imagine myself and talk about, like,
right.
what? And yet, that combination of the EMDR and then moving on to the parts work, which is now what we do. Like, we've kind of,
Mhm.
the EMDR, we're kind of done with that. And then we just kind of continue on in the parts work as I need it. Can you, what you haven't done already, can you describe what internal family systems is, what parts work is, and why it is so helpful?
Yeah. Well, we started off talking about dissonance, right? Where and parts, it's just a way of kind of giving yourself handles to understand that. A part of me, it almost personifies the impulse
Mm.
because it's so abstract what's happening inside of us. A part of me just, I know I shouldn't reach for the booze, but man, a part of me just wants to.
Yeah.
It just wants to.
Yeah.
And so this work kind of, it brings us out of our cognitive self and just into a whole embodied kind of experience of, and most people really resonate to it. Yeah. No, a part of me is, you know, yelling at my kids, even while I deeply love them and never would want to harm them.
Yeah.
How is that possible? And it just helps sort of provide this personification of these competing parts. The best illustration of it, I think in modern years, is the Inside Out movies that are for children. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why everybody loves them, right? We have these different,
Yes.
it's sort of a personification of these different voices in our heads because they're not just voices. They're sort of almost like, it's like you can almost feel the energy of that part of me. And that part of me that really just wants to do what I want may be sort of rebellious or willful. It also, only you will know, it also might be like, I can't get through this day without this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to understand that and get curious about that because that is the only way I'm going to truly be able to partner with God's Spirit to help that part of me transform.
Yeah. We'll be right back after this. So you said a word there that has been honestly just transformational in my life. And that word is curious. And I
Yes.
think when I so I've been sober, when we're recording this, 16 months. And
Mm.
I would say that before I would feel shame, I'd feel anger, a lot of times directed at myself. And now I've gotten into a habit of being curious. If I start
Yeah.
feeling something, okay, why am I feeling that? Can you talk about the power of curiosity, especially with yourself.
Yeah, it's so powerful. So the two things that I think are so transformational about this model are number one, this idea that it's only one part of who you are. The addicted part of you is not all of you. It
Mm.
is not the depressed part of you is not all of who you are. It can feel like I am depressed when in fact, or I am an addict, or I am anxious. When in fact, what's really going on in your soul is a part of you has hijacked you. It's hijacked the system and taken up too much space in the system, but it's not inherently who you are as a child of God. But it is a part of you. And so it allows the both and of that. There is a part of me that is doing this thing or is feeling this way. It's not all of who I am. So number one, that differentiation is just so powerful for people to begin to realize this is not all of who I am. It's a part of me. It's a hurting part of me. Then we introduce curiosity. Can I get curious about this part of me? I don't have to hate it because it's not all of me. It's a part of me that needs my help and needs my care and needs my guidance and might need some gentle boundaries, some healthy boundaries as well, right? That's hence the title Boundaries for Your Soul.
Yeah.
Can I get curious about this part of me? Because shame never helps. Shame
Mm.
never helps. And almost always, right there at the beginning of this work, you begin to realize there's a part of me that really wants to keep doing this behavior, in this case, maybe addiction. There's a part of me that just can't stop anxiously ruminating, whatever the thing is, right? When you begin to sense that, almost always you will sense another part of you, the part of you that hates that part, the
Yes.
part of you, the critic, right? The critic, the shaming part of you. And that part of you is also trying to help, not helpful. It's not helpful. And so much of the work is to beginning to replace that voice of inner criticism, of shame, and again, a partnership with God's Spirit with a voice of a posture of curiosity. I
Mm.
wonder what that's about. And right there, we begin to tap into that, what we call the spirit-led self, the place
Yes.
inside where we can be present to these different parts of us. Honestly, we can see them. We're not denying them any longer. I am doing this thing. And I am also tapped into now the place where the Holy Spirit lives inside, the spirit-led self, the place of calm nervous system is another way you can look at it, where I can actually take some deep breaths and eyes wide open, get curious about what's really going on there. What do I really need in this
Mm.
moment? What's really going on? And then we can begin to transform ourselves one part at a time.
So there's a name for a part. I think you call them, if I'm not mistaken, you correct me if I'm wrong. Is it firefighters?
Yeah.
Talk about the firefighter parts of us,
Yeah.
because I think that was really eye-opening
Yeah.
for me.
So in the model, there are three primary categories of parts, which I like because that's sort of Trinitarian. We're made in the image of God. We're internally relational. So the three types of parts, there's manager parts, firefighter parts, and these exiles. I talked a little about the exiles. These are the parts of us, a lot of times that go all the way back to childhood, that carry the pain from the past, but also current pain that we don't want to face. We want to push that aside. What the other two parts, the managers and the firefighters, are trying to help us cope without dealing with that pain. And so the
Uh-huh.
manager parts of us are the parts of us that show up in the world. They want to perfect, they want to produce, they want to please, they want to perform, they want to control, they want to analyze. They're trying to prevent pain. And those are the typical strategies that those parts of us use, right? If I can be perfect enough, I won't have to feel this pain. If
Yes.
I can be controlling enough, I won't have to feel this pain. If I can analyze enough, I won't have to feel this pain, right? They have all these different strategies. The firefighter parts of us, to their name, are this second category of part that come out when the pain starts to surface. The manager's been working really hard, but it's not working. Shoot, I'm starting to notice that pain is coming to the surface. The firefighter comes in and to put out the flames of pain. So they're trying to numb the pain, to escape from the pain. And those are the parts of us that reach for the booze, that reach for the food, that reach for the Netflix, that reach for the gambling, all of the ways that we check out and distract ourselves. They're responding to inner chaos, to inner pain, to
Yeah.
try to douse it out. And a lot of folks, that starts early on, especially with addictions. That strategy of, I can't tolerate what's happening. I've got to find something to cope with it.
Yep.
There are parts of us trying to survive. And so as you become more aware of those different parts inside of you and you get curious about them instead of shaming them, you can start to realign. And the healthy system, each of those parts plays a valid role.
Mhm.
But we haven't exiled the pain. And so we're aware of it. We're like, oh man, think about grief, John. I think about the parts of us that carry sadness. Sadness doesn't have to overwhelm us. Anna Lemke in her book Dopamine Nation talks about how when we tend to the right amount of pain over time, that pain no longer becomes intolerable. We actually
Mm.
need to be able to go, man, I'm a little bit sad today. I've got to go to work. So my manager part's going to come out, going to get me to work, and I'm going to show up, but I'm going to carry with me this little bit of sadness.
Yeah.
Both of those things can coexist.
Yeah.
And when we do that, then that firefighter comes in later in the day and says, man, you worked really hard today. You were sad. You went to work. You did the things. Let's do something really nice for
Mm.
ourselves. What would that be that would feel really good in a healthy way, right? So those parts can be constructive when we bring the system into alignment.
I think it is such a perfect analogy for what I experienced, right? I had this trauma. I had these coping mechanisms that developed. I published my first book, and my drinking actually got better, right? Because the manager part of me,
Yeah.
life was
working.
great. Yeah,
Yes.
great. But
Yes.
then, as you know, you publish a book, the press dies down. It never does as well as you think it should absolutely do, right? And then the lies really start, right? And then that's where, for me, the alcohol firefighter came in and was like, let's douse this, right? It is such a perfect analogy. And yeah.
And I would say to that example, John, after the surge of the book dies down, right? The pain that you feel isn't just about that. It's the
Right.
whole backlog. I call it the long tail of pain that goes all the way back to the messages from when you're 5-year-old. I'm not good enough. I'm worthless. Whatever those messages are that haven't been healed all the way back. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a lot that comes in that those firefighters have to deal with.
Which is so interesting you talk about that. I mean, I remember, and I think I talked about this either in my workbook or the first book, but where I remember the first time I started feeling those feelings, they seemingly came out of nowhere. I mean, I was maybe 12, and my mom, we lived in rural Wisconsin. Our mailbox was at the end of a gravel road. We pull up, we get the mail. I go out to get the mail. I get the mail and I look through and there's nothing for me. I'm 12. Of course there's nothing for me. But this lie, and I remember it just gripped me for the rest of the day. And I remember telling her, I'm not important. No one cares about me. And she's like, where is this coming from? And I get it. She was confused, right? I didn't know where it was coming from, but for whatever reason, it was like that triggering moment of like, yeah, that's the backlog, right? That's part of the lie that I then
It wasn't
believed.
only about the mail.
No.
Exactly.
No.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
So you talk about going back to part of the naming conversation. There is a part of I shouldn't feel this way that I think is just absolutely beautiful, and it's where you talk. I mean, there's plenty of parts I think are absolutely beautiful, but where you talk about Jacob, and he's wrestling, and his name means receiver. Or excuse me, deceiver. And you talk about the idea of a holy reframe. And I think it is such beautiful language. I quoted it in Confessions of a Christian Alcoholic. But can you talk about this idea of a holy reframe?
Yeah, we have in psychology a lot of language around reframing our thoughts. So I believe that I'm a bad person. Well, how do I reframe that? Well, I'm someone who's doing my best, right? But what I find when you magnify that with the power of God's Spirit, right, where you get a whole new narrative, a whole new story, a whole new name in Jacob's case, it's just so powerful. And in that story in particular, if you think about his story, he's done some kind of crummy things.
Right.
We don't talk about that, but
Yes.
kind of swindled his brother and did some crummy things. And there's a reason his brother is pretty mad at him.
Yeah.
But then you also, when you follow his story, he's grown. He's actually also been
Mhm.
hurt himself. He's really worked to become a man of integrity. He's paid some of his debts. You have this sense that he's a different person now. That doesn't erase
Mhm.
the things that he's done in the past, but he is a different person now. Now he's got to face his brother, right? In this moment when he has the dream, he's got, and who, this was back in the day before social media. So for all he knows, his brother's still, you know, carrying that same gripe from
Yeah.
however many years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so we'll forget about social media, the days before newspapers. And so it's like he's wrestling with God, and this is my kind of take on it, but he's wrestling with God. And there is this wrestling of, I am still that guy I was. That guy's in me, he remembers that. He's not, again, this kind of gets us out of the gaslighting of I'm not that person anymore. Well, that guy's still there too, but I'm also more than that guy. I've
Mm.
grown, I've changed. And there's that wrestling with God, and there's it's a really powerful moment where he's given a new name and a new story,
Yes.
by God, that transcends all of these things. And so that's that holy reframe I think so many of us can relate to. I can't necessarily erase the sins, for lack of a better word, of my past. I can't
Mhm.
erase what I've done. But there's something transcendent in those moments when we really wrestle with all of that with God, where God doesn't, even the fact that Jacob comes out of that with a limp, I think
Yes.
there's a real thing of like, yeah, there's a real, sometimes there are wounds that don't fully get healed, wounds maybe to other people, wounds to ourselves. I think we yearn for that kind of honesty in this day and age, right? And instead of the quick fix and also I've wrestled with God and I'm okay and I'm a new person and I'm coming out of this and I'm going into a whole new life and a whole new calling with a whole new name and a whole new narrative. And that's the holy reframe. I think the holy reframe, that word holy, whole, accounts for the
Mm.
whole of the story. But it also transcends that story when we bring it into partnership with God.
Well, that has been, in a sense, the story of the last, over a year and a half for
Yeah.
me. And so when
Yeah.
I read that, it just resonated with me. And I hope that it resonates with people who are listening, because I think my message to them, I think what your message to them is too, is that, you can be Jacob that has a limp, that there are consequences,
Yeah.
right? There are things that you
Yes.
may have to live with for the rest of your life, but that part of Jacob doesn't have
Yes.
to be all of Jacob, right?
No way.
My
That's right.
alcoholic self, the things I did and said, those are a part of me, and I'm owning them. And I'm,
Yeah.
I'm in a sense, maybe proud is the wrong word, but they're a part of me and they've shaped who I am today. And now I can own that, right? I joke with people that,
Yes.
like, my goal is to be uncancelable. And what I mean is, like, I'm just going to own it. Like, if you have a story about
Yeah.
me, in the past, like, I'd be like, yep, exactly. That was
Come
that
on
old
in.
part of me,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
Exactly.
I
So,
think we yearn for that kind of honesty. I love that you're bringing that to the surface. Yeah.
well, Dr. Cook, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such a treat. I cannot encourage everyone enough to get I Shouldn't Feel This Way, to get Boundaries for Your Soul, and to listen to the Best of You podcast. I am a regular listener. I really appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you. The Christian mental health space is one that needs people like you, and I would say even the Christian addiction space, because your stuff
Yeah.
is so transferable. So,
Yeah.
if people want to learn more about you, if they want to get in touch with what you're doing, where should they go?
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. DrAlisonCook.com is my website, kind of the hub of everything. You can find all the links there. I'm Dr. Alison Cook on Instagram and Facebook. I show up there sporadically. And then the Best of You podcast is anywhere podcasts are found.
What is, by the way, and you don't have to answer this, but I'm springing this on you because I don't think your world is done with just I Shouldn't Feel This Way. Is there anything you're working on, or is there anything that's kind of noodling in that brain of yours that we might expect to see something else on?
I do. I am working on other projects. Nothing I can really formally announce, but
Okay.
yes, I know. But yes, you're right. Always working on other projects. Really, just trying to think about what's going to serve folks that are, engaged with my work. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thanks again. And maybe as we kind of progress on this, we'll have an excuse to have you back
Yeah.
on to talk more. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you.
What a gift, right? Was that as encouraging to you as it was to me, even just listening to it back again? I just think that the idea that healing is possible, that our trauma doesn't have to have the final word, and that, naming our struggles without shame can really be a doorway to transformation. All of those things I think are just so important, and especially, like I said in the intro, the idea of a holy reframe, that story of Jacob and how the Lord can rewrite the narrative of our lives, even though we walk away with a limp. And I can be honest, I walk with a limp, right? Like there are still some things that pop up that, I walk with a limp. And so I think the goal is not necessarily to walk without a limp, but I think it's to give glory to the Lord for how he has changed the narrative of our stories, given us a new name like he did with Jacob. Again, if you appreciated any of that, please pick up her books, Boundaries for Your Soul, and I Shouldn't Feel This Way. You can also give her podcast a listen, The Best of You. Really great podcast. Some great people that she has on there as well. Thank you for joining me. If you've enjoyed this, please rate, subscribe. And one thing I guess I really haven't asked you to do is share. Like, is there one person that you can think of that there was something said in this episode that you're like, you know what? They need to hear this. Could you just send it to them? Just like hit the share button and text it to them. I think that's really important. Like, I want the message of what is being said on this podcast to get to the people who need it most. And you listener, person listening right now, know who needs it the most. So if there's one person that you can think of, please share it with them. As always, check out lifeaudio.com, our podcast partner that makes this show possible, for some other great podcasts. We'll see you here next week.